Hello again. This time I want to introduce my longest translation of the 4 Japanese to English translations that I've done. Here's the title, Baron Kaneko and the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, a study in the public diplomacy of Japan. And this is Baron Kaneko with Ito Hirobumi before he goes on his mission to the United States in 1904. It's written by Professor Matsumura, Masayoshi Matsumura, former diplomat in the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and translated by me. This is the hardcover. It's quite thick, as you can see. We've got a picture of Kaneko on the back. There is also paperback, which is a bit lighter, not so heavy. And again, it's the same content. And this is both the hardcover and paperback are 6 by 9 inches. However, there is another rather cute small paperback, which is, I think, something like 4.25 inches in width and 6.88 inches in height. But this has the same, exactly the same. Oh, sorry, it doesn't. It doesn't have the photograph of Baron Kaneko on the back. There was no room for it. But I made this one, and this would be ideal for trains, I suppose, where the space is limited, as long as you can read the print, which is a tad small, I suppose, but it's definitely readable. Packed trains heading to the center of Tokyo, who knows? Also, I would like to just prove or show that it really is on Lulu and Amazon. There we are. There's the hardcover on Lulu. The paperback and ebook are also available on Lulu, and here it is on Amazon. Hardcover, paperback, Kindle. Okay, so really, I think I've successfully covered all the bases, and now it's just a matter of my reading some of it to show you what it is, what's in there. Of course, there's look inside the book on Amazon, so you could actually take a look at it yourself slowly. Yeah, there we are, pocket-sized paperback, 4.25 inches by 6.88 inches, and a rather lengthy explanation of the front of the painting on the front cover. And there's Kaneko, Prime Minister Katsura Taro, Ito Hirobumi, Comrade Taro, who headed the negotiations at the Treaty of Portsmouth, Suematsu Kensho, Takahashi Korekyo. By the way, Suematsu Kensho, I have done another translation from Professor Matsumura about Suematsu Kensho, who was on a similar mission to Europe during the Russo-Japanese War. Here's a Chinese poem composed by Kaneko on his way to the United States in February-March 1904. Bravely I head to my faraway former playground. He was a student in America, just as Suematsu Kensho was a student at Cambridge University. So that's how Ito divided the missions between them. And here's the table of contents. Author's preface to the English version, translator's notes, and then Part 1, Baron Kaneko's mission, with various chapters as you see there. Chapter 1, secret instructions from the government. Chapter 2, America's strict neutrality. Chapter 3, American feelings towards Japan at the start of the war. American sympathy for the underdog, being Japan. Chapter 4, intimacy with Roosevelt, that is, intimacy of Kaneko with Roosevelt. Chapter 5, the center of activity for public diplomacy. Part 2, Kaneko's activities and epoch-making speeches. So Chapter 1, the Bushido mentality and chivalry. Chapter 2, allegorical speech-making. Chapter 3, a temporary propaganda offensive from Russia. Chapter 4, support for the issue of foreign bonds. Chapter 5, the theory of Christian versus pagan countries. Chapter 6, the need to observe Germany's movements. Chapter 7, the St. Louis International Exposition. Chapter 8, the Alumni Association of Harvard University. Yes, Kaneko studied at Harvard. Part 3, preventing the spread of yellow peril, kind of paranoia against Asiatic peoples. Chapter 1, the problem of Russian warships escaping into ports of neutral countries. Chapter 2, war correspondence of foreign newspapers. Chapter 3, positive steps to financial publicity. Chapter 4, Kaneko's essay, the yellow peril is the golden opportunity for Japan. Chapter 5, the anguish of the Russian ambassador, Count Cassini. Then part 4, changes in the course of the war and developments in diplomacy, with chapter 1, Washington, D.C. and cultural lectures. Chapter 2, an important personally signed letter from the German Emperor, the Kaiser. Chapter 3, a secret envoy on a mission to foment revolution in Russia. Chapter 4, the Society of Friends of Russian Freedom, and then the illustrations between pages 245 and 246. Part 5, the success of the mission. Chapter 1, the social season. Chapter 2, symposium at Yale University. Chapter 3, Japan's best friend, Theodore Roosevelt. Chapter 4, interest increasing in the problems of the Far East after the war. Victory at the Battle of Mukden. Chapter 6, Roosevelt's steadfast goodwill. Chapter 7, Carnegie Hall. Chapter 8, the 7 military precepts. Chapter 9, praise for the Anglo-Japanese alliance. Part 6, the high watermark of pro-Japanese sympathies and the reaction. Chapter 1, a trip to Mount Vernon. Chapter 2, the cooperation of pro-Japanese American women. Chapter 3, a lucky omen, the president goes hunting bears. Not bears, not in Russia, I hasten to add, but of course the bear is the symbol of Russia. Chapter 4, change of tone, an omen of the changing tide of the times. Chapter 5, the great victory of the Battle of the Japan Sea in the Straits of Tsushima, the one masterminded, the naval victory masterminded by Togo Heihachiro, who had trained in Britain. Part 7, the Portsmouth Peace Conference and Kaneko's hidden activity. Chapter 1, the ending of public diplomacy. Chapter 2, Kaneko's new mission, a duty of liaison. Chapter 3, the Japanese plenipotentiaries in their predicament. Chapter 4, peace concluded with great difficulty. And then part 8. Gosh, was that part 8? That was part 7 then, was it? Yes, okay. Did I miss reading that? I don't know. Right, the Portsmouth Peace Conference and Kaneko's hidden activity is part 7. And part 8 is the Russo-Japanese War in America. Chapter 1, the annulment of the Katsura Harriman Note, and Chapter 2, the American people and the Russo-Japanese War. And then there's a bibliography, chronology, and index. So it's over 500 pages, as you can see. It was hard work to do this translation. So now I think I'm going to read the author's preface to the English version. I wonder if I can make this a bit bigger. Yes, I can. There we are. Okay, so not only in Japan, but also in America, Russia, South Korea, and even in Israel, at the centenary of the Russo-Japanese War in 2004-5, international symposia and commemorative events were organized and held in more than 10 places. It was the intention of the author to publish a 3rd edition of his book, NichiRo Senso to Kaneko Kentaro, Kohou Gaikou no Kenkyuu, first published almost 30 years ago in 1980, and with a 2nd revised edition in 1987 to coincide with these events. However, various circumstances unfortunately made this impossible, much to my regret. Then by great good fortune, several years ago, I was approached by Professor Ian Ruxton of Kyushu Institute of Technology, who has excellent Japanese language skills, and declared his desire to make an English translation of my book. He is known as a researcher into the life of Sir Ernest Sato, the British diplomat, who was for a time Minister Plenipotentiary in the Meiji era in Japan. This unexpected but kind proposal was beyond all my hopes. So immediately I requested that he undertake this very difficult translation. That was about 2 years ago, and now that this wonderful translation has appeared, I have not sufficient words to express my gratitude. Naturally, this translation has been brought up to date with various additions, and it is therefore equivalent to the 3rd edition mentioned above. Recently in Japan, the phrases public diplomacy and soft power, written in katakana and meaning overseas publicity, have been frequently and widely publicized. The author was already using the phrase Kohou Gaikou more than 30 years ago with the same meaning. There was also Taishimin Gaikou, literally diplomacy aimed at the citizens of foreign countries. And it is an interesting question which phrase will establish itself from now on in the Japanese language. At any rate, the government of one country aims to work on the citizens of other countries to create a friendly climate of opinion, which will facilitate the execution of its foreign policy. It is overseas publicity activities in this sense which is meant, and the substance of diplomatic activity and the publicity thereof must always be made to accord with each other. This is the fundamental principle. If it is not respected, untrue overseas propaganda is often the result, and so-called senden gaikou, literally propaganda diplomacy. There are still not many people who are aware that public diplomacy based on this most important principle was appropriately emphasized and practiced by the leaders of the Japanese government more than 100 years ago. As soon as the Russo-Japanese War broke out, the then president of the Privy Council, Ito Hirobumi, immediately sent the member of the House of Peers, Baron Kaneko Kentaro, to America to announce Japan's war aims overseas, to work in close concert with the minister to the United States, Takahira Kogoro, and beginning with President Roosevelt, to lead the whole of the American public towards support for Japan. That's President Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, which he succeeded in doing. Kaneko's great mission, together with Vice President of the Bank of Japan, Takahashi Korekio's important work in raising foreign loans for Japan's war effort, was the highlight of Japanese diplomacy in the Russo-Japanese War. Even though now, at the centenary of the Russo-Japanese War, various research has revealed Kaneko's marvelous achievements, and they have become much better known, the details are still unknown to many. The author experienced for himself Kaneko's feelings and activities at the time of the Russo-Japanese War as intimately as if they had been his own, and in a way that others could not imitate, as a result of his work as the consul responsible for publicity and cultural affairs at the Japanese Consulate General in New York in the first half of the 1970s. I was from the beginning interested in diplomatic history and publicity work, and I was aware that at the time of the Russo-Japanese War, Baron Kaneko had traveled to America and, while continuing to deepen his friendship with President Theodore Roosevelt, had made efforts to make American public opinion friendlier to Japan. But when I was appointed consul in New York, Japan-US fiber negotiations were not going smoothly, and above all, President Nixon had not consulted America's ally Japan before restoring diplomatic relations with communist China, and had dramatically announced a plan to visit that country, and the devaluation of the US dollar was suddenly decided, and so on. As my duties were in the area of publicity and cultural affairs, I received the full force of the so-called Nixon shock head-on, and I had to work even harder to step up our efforts to present Japan in a positive way to America and the American people. Of course, at that time in the eastern part of America, there was no other Japanese consular establishment apart from New York, so to introduce the situation of Japan and the Japanese way of thinking, either alone or accompanied by the Consul General, I often made speeches and attended debates and social gatherings. There is no doubt that this deepened my involvement further in the practice and research of public diplomacy. From this situation, the author was bound to take an interest in Kaneko's important secret mission given him at the time of the Russo-Japanese War by Marquis Ito, that's Ito Hirobumi, to befriend President Roosevelt on behalf of Japan, and his efforts and achievements in winning over American public opinion. It was an excellent precedent for my own work, and I wanted to investigate and research it. So as it was easily combined with my work, I followed in the footsteps of Kaneko, who had made New York the base for his publicity activities for 1.5 years, and who had literally run around all points of the compass, struggling day and night to create a climate of opinion favorable to Japan. And in fact, while I followed Kaneko's trail of speeches, press conferences, social gatherings, essays, and articles written in which he worked like a man possessed, I traveled, of course, to Washington, D.C. and the cultural city of Boston, and from the summer resort of Harpswell in the northern state of Maine down to St. Louis in the state of Missouri in the south, where once the World Fair had been held in 1904. I visited all the places where Kaneko had been and collected and examined all the data I could obtain inferring the situation at that time from the available historical evidence. The results of that investigation and data collection were, even if I say so myself, that I obtained admirable and precious material. Then, after my return to Japan, I began to work for the Japan Foundation and was able to visit the diplomatic archives of the Foreign Office and the modern Japanese political history materials room, Kensei Shiryoshitsu, of the National Diet Library many times. And the result of the materials assembled was the above-mentioned book, NichiRo Senso to Kaneko Kentaro, Kohou Gaikou no Kenkyuu, first edition, 1980. Kaneko Kentaro was not a minister and extraordinary and plenipotentiary like Takahira, who was the minister to the United States, and was certainly not an official ambassador, but merely a baron and an ordinary member of the House of Peers. But he had already served as Minister for Agriculture and Commerce in Ito's second cabinet and Minister for Justice in Ito's third cabinet. And when he was leaving for America on that occasion, he was told by Prime Minister Katsura Taro that if he so wished, he could be given the title of Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary, and he undoubtedly had the qualifications to be granted such an honor. Considering his special mission in America at that time, in modern-day parlance, he was nothing other than an ambassador for public diplomacy. Kaneko's publicity was not limited to politics and diplomacy, but extended to fields which at that time tended to be overlooked by Japanese people, such as religious and women's issues. It even included labor problems. He raised the level of the activity itself. Over 100 years ago, he was already practicing modern publicity techniques. The result was that the sociable and eloquent Kaneko, for the period of almost 1.5 years of his stay in America, from the commencement of the war until the peace conference in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, sometimes appealed to Western chivalry based on similarities with Japanese Bushido, and at other times to the American national character and its support for the underdog, and gave more than 100 lectures and contributed several tens of articles and essays to newspapers and magazines. In this way, he succeeded in converting American public opinion from support of Russia to 80% support for Japan. Indeed, already more than a century ago in America, he was a vigorous practitioner of what at that time in Japan was called manipulation of foreign newspapers, Gaikoku Shinbun Soju, and is now known as public diplomacy, Kohou Gaikou, and was remarkably successful at it. Looking back more than 20 years, on October 15, 1985, in Washington, D.C., at Johns Hopkins University, an event was held to celebrate the occasion of the 75th birthday of the world's leading authority on Japan at that time, the former US ambassador to Japan, Edwin O. Reischauer, professor emeritus of Harvard University. The first lecturer to occupy the dais was the late Professor Marius B. Jansen, or is it Jansen, of Princeton University's East Anglia Institute. And in front of that distinguished gathering, he not only referred to the authors NichiRo Senso to Kaneko Kentaro, Kohou Gaikou no Kenkyuu more than once, but when speaking of US-Japan relations at the time of the Russo-Japanese War stated, a recent study of that interlude, the Russo-Japanese War, by Dr. Masayoshi Matsumura is invaluable, which was much more praise than this author deserved. However, it has remained in my memory and will certainly stay there for the rest of my life. The book which received such unmerited praise is more than 500 pages long, and if it were not for Professor Ruxton's efforts to understand the many difficult words and phrases left behind by Kaneko, this splendid translation would never have seen the light of day. Once again, I thank him from the bottom of my heart for his labors. Matsumura Masayoshi, May 2009. And I just follow up with the translator's notes, which I wrote. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, was waged not only as a titanic struggle between vast armies and navies in East Asia and by spies, fifth columnists, and disaffected civilians within Russia and other countries, but also as a personal and public duel between diplomats on both sides, seeking to gain the support of the neutral and partisan citizens of America and Europe, in a way which has become very familiar to us in the early years of the present century, especially through the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. The noted British diplomat and Japanologist Sir Hugh Kotatsi, I might call him a scholar diplomat in the mold of Sato actually, recently observed The war in Afghanistan hinges on winning the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. The Way Forward in Afghanistan, Japan Times, May the 21st, 2009. So it was with the Russo-Japanese War. In that crucial intellectual conflict for hearts and minds, Baron Kaneko played a key role in the United States on behalf of his country, Japan, as this book clearly indicates at length and in detail. It therefore gives me much pleasure and satisfaction to be able to publish this English translation of Professor Matsumura's important book, which gives an account from Japanese sources usually unavailable to historians working only in the English language. He has looked over the English proofs with great care and attention, offered a lot of helpful and detailed advice, and in many places updated and amended the original text in the light of current scholarship to make this work, in essence, a third edition. However, all remaining errors of substance and style are the translator's. Japanese personal names are given in the Japanese order, i.e. family name before given name. Years of birth and death have been added where known. Romanization has followed the Kenkyuu modified Hepburn form. In the case of a few names of apparently obscure persons, it has not been possible to confirm the correct spelling of their surnames when only katakana was available in the original Japanese text. In these cases, a question mark has been added after the name in question, question mark within square brackets, that is. Two appendices in the form of supplementary articles on the so-called Yale Symposium and the Japanese reporters at the Portsmouth Peace Conference, which were included in the Japanese version, have been omitted from this English translation to prevent the book from becoming overly long. Finally, the sincere thanks of the author and translator are due to Mr. Bob Young and all at Lulu.com for their assistance in making this project possible. Ian Ruxton, May 2009. And so that, well, then there's some other books by myself. Japanese Students at Cambridge University, and Ultimate Crush, which I have introduced as videos on my YouTube channel recently. Diaries and Letters of Sir Ernest Mason Sato, that was my first book about Sato, and then various books about Sato, which I have most of them introduced already on my YouTube channel. And then I think we will read a bit of the main text, or let's read chapter 1, shall we? Part 1, Baron Kaneko's mission. Chapter 1, Secret Instructions from the Government. 1, the Japanese policy dependent on the United States and Britain. Immediately after the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, in the 27th and 28th years of the reign of Emperor Meiji, Japan experienced the so-called Triple Intervention of April 1895. I've added a footnote. As you can see, there's a 1 there. I've added a footnote. These are at the bottom of the page. I don't propose to read them all because it will make this video very long, but there it is. The triple or tripartite intervention, Sangoku Kansho. Okay, so I've attempted to provide some extra explanations for English readers of English, I should say. Okay, so Japan experienced the so-called triple intervention of April 1895, Meiji 28, that's the 28th year of Meiji, led by Russia, supported by Germany and France. Very soon, in the eyes of the Japanese people, Russia became a resented hypothetical enemy, and their feelings were summed up in the phrase Gashin Shotan, struggling against difficulties for revenge. Moreover, it is said that they began to think even more seriously of the possibility of war in the near future with that same country after the events of the Boxer Rebellion, Giwa Dan Jihen, in 1900, Meiji 33. Yes, it all ties in with Ernest Sato, of course, by the way, my main research. Okay. The Boxers were a new religious group which resisted the severe pressure exerted on China by the imperialist great powers of Europe and the United States, and rose up under the slogan Fushin Metsuyo, support China, crush the West. In order to suppress them, Russia, Britain, France, America, Italy, Japan, and others sent a combined expeditionary force. However, after the incident had been resolved, Russia refused to withdraw her armies from Manchuria. Russia, supported by French capital as a result of the Franco-Russian alliance and urged on by Germany, began to plan not only the military occupation of Manchuria, but also of Korea, a country the control of which Japan had for some time past considered essential to her national security. Sato actually refers to it as their Alsace-Lorraine in a letter back to the Foreign Office. The Japanese Alsace-Lorraine, that is. In the end, the conflict between the two nations developed into a war. This was precisely the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5. Carrying on. Of course, before that, Japan had realized that she could not possibly confront Russia on her own, even though since the opening of the country about 40 years previously, Japan had in a short time made strenuous efforts and great strides towards modernization. This was the age of high imperialism, and she feared the partition of China, which would be of no profit to her. She was naturally able to sympathize with the United States in this respect, which had annexed Hawaii in 1897 and the following year fought the Spanish-American War in a late advance into the Far East. As the two nations felt the same way with regard to diplomatic policy, in 1899, 32nd year of Emperor Meiji's reign, Meiji 32, Japan sided with America in her demand that the territorial integrity of China be preserved and an open door policy be implemented. Also, Japan, in view of the Russian promotion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad as a means of linking the markets of Europe and China by an overland route and seeking to prevent Russia's advance southwards in 1902, Meiji 35, concluded the Anglo-Japanese alliance with Great Britain, which was attempting to control trade between Europe and China through the maritime route via Shanghai. By these means, Japan was able to strengthen her attitude and position with regard to Russia. In this way, Russia remained in the Far East even after the Boxer Rebellion. Japan began negotiations with Russia in 1903, Meiji 36, not only to drive her out of Manchuria, but also to hold back her military advance into the Korean peninsula. However, Russia's vague and even bigoted responses, which stubbornly showed no signs of compromise, meant that those negotiations also ground to a halt at the beginning of 1904, Meiji 37. This coincided with a whipping up of war hysteria within Japan, and this swiftly led to conjectures that it was almost too late to avoid imminent war between the two countries. But it must be said that in the prevailing international situation, for Japan to conduct a war with Russia, the prospects were undeniably very uncertain. For example, even Major General Iguchi Shogo, 1855 to 1925, the Chief of General Affairs, who was at the center of the hawkish element in the General Staff Office, planned to limit the impending hostilities with Russia to no further than Harbin in Manchuria. Harbin would be the Japanese pronunciation at any rate. In his June memorandum, yes, there's a footnote there, of the year before the war began, 1903, even though Iguchi stated that it was necessary for the Japanese army to occupy Harbin, he also emphasized that it was not desirable to follow the Russian army deep into Siberia, and that there was no profit for us and only loss in such an action. It would be a grave error for the Japanese army to make a deep invasion into Siberia for the purpose of pursuing the Russian army, even if the latter were to retreat to the north. But Harbin is a strategically important place as a point connecting the west with the east on the rail track of the East China Railway. If we could occupy Harbin, it would mean that the occupation of Manchuria would be sure for Japan, and at the same time, the fate of the naval port at Vladivostok would be decided. Therefore, we must occupy Harbin by making our army advance to it by all means. And it means also that our advance beyond Harbin to the north will do more harm than good for us. That is, Harbin should be regarded as the strategic target for our land warfare. But from the following year to the one after that, 1904-5, when it came to the actual fighting, it became clear that even that plan was over-optimistic. And after the Battle of Mukden, the Japanese army even lost the power needed to advance to Harbin. The army was quite unable to deliver a decisive blow to Russia, whose armies were the strongest in the world at the time. In the same memorandum, Iguchi, who recognized the strategic importance of Harbin, also stated, "We should stay at Harbin and should counterattack the Russian army if they come to attack us therein. And even if they do not come to attack us at Harbin, we should remain there and maintain the status quo for a long time. As a result, Russia will strongly feel the inconvenience and will approach us with a request for making peace between themselves and Japan. Even this time would be a very good chance for us. We could eventually conclude a peace treaty with Russia on conditions favorable for us, as well as being able to maintain peace in the future. Thus, he predicted the outcome of the Russo-Japanese War. But for the Japanese army to adopt a defensive posture at Harbin and continue the war indefinitely was an absolute impossibility. And as is widely known, it was through the mediation of President Roosevelt that the war finally ended and peace was concluded. The memorandum also expressed deep anxiety about Japan's finances and national wealth. It declared, "What is of the utmost necessity and greatest concern for us due to its shortage is not any military or maritime power nor intelligence, but financial power for this country." And it continued, "The expenses of both the Japanese Army and Navy in accomplishing the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-5 are estimated at 200 million yen. If, on the basis of this estimated figure, we conjecture the expenses which will be needed to fight against Russia, it will be enough to prepare approximately 500 million yen for the purpose of carrying out such a war. If of this amount we appropriate 150 million yen as the amount borne by our national treasury, there would be no other way than both of increasing taxes and floating a public loan in order to raise the remaining 350 million yen. Now, when it comes to floating such a loan, part omitted here, there will be two ways. That is, one way is to raise such a public loan amounting to 350 million yen in the interior of Japan, and the other way is to do it outside this country. I think that it would be most advisable to request Britain to be creditor for floating such a loan, because Britain is interested in the Manchurian problem and desires Japan to confront Russia with her own military power by the agreement of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. If we do so, such a way will bring one more benefit. I mean that I consider Japan could take advantage of the Anglo-Japanese alliance while Russia alone opposes us, although it is not possible for us to ask Britain with her military power to participate in our war against Russia. But it would be a natural benefit for us that Britain, in her foreign policy, should give directly and indirectly any profit around the war in her relations with Japan as borrower and debtor." Just a word of explanation there. The Anglo-Japanese alliance, initially formed in 1902, signed in late January 1902 in London, was a defensive alliance in the sense that if one party was attacked by more than one other country, in other words, if there was a third party involved, then the other contracting party in the treaty, which was Japan or Britain, would come to the aid of the one that was attacked. I hope that makes sense. I think it does. So that was how the alliance was initially constructed, as a kind of defensive alliance with Russia in mind, and possibly participation alongside Russia by France or Germany. Anyway, with regard to this, it is said that the Vice Chief of the General Staff, Kodama Gentaro, 1852 to 1906, estimated the costs of the war at 800 million yen, but the actual result of the war was naval and military expenses amounting to 1.746 billion yen. Wow. And extra costs of various ministries of 238 million yen for a total of 1.984 billion yen. These expenses far exceeded the estimates in Iguchi's memorandum, and they had to be paid before the war came to a close. Of these costs, no more than 215 million yen were covered by increases in domestic taxation. So it is no misrepresentation of reality to state that almost 80% of the war expenses were financed by public loans, bonds, at home and abroad. In particular, 1.2 billion yen depended on the raising of foreign loans, mainly on the British and American markets. Thus, it is important to focus on the constraints that Japan's inevitable war on which she was about to embark with Russia was to be limited geographically to Harbin and in time to about 1 year at the most. It was clearly to be a limited war. Therefore, among the leaders of the Japanese government, who well understood their own country's weakness, it was envisaged that a third country might have to mediate a peace settlement at an appropriate time, as can be seen clearly in the language of Marquis Ito Hirobumi, 1841 to 1909. Whether this war continues for 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years is not yet known, but if the outcome is not clearly decided, a third country will have to come between both countries to mediate between us. In fact, in July of 1904, Meiji 37, just 6 months after the war had begun, Foreign Minister Komura Jutaro, 1855 to 1911, submitted an unfinished memorandum to Prime Minister Katsura Taro, 1848 to 1913, regarding conditions for making peace, in which he stated, the fall of Port Arthur, which in Chinese is Lushun and in Japanese Ryojun, and the major battle of Liaoyang, in Japanese Ryoyo, are assumed to be the first stage at which peace negotiations can be discussed. This really meant that war was being prosecuted with conditions for making peace borne in mind the whole time. Komura therefore recognized in his memorandum that this war had the ability to decide the fate of Russia, and that it certainly would not be easy for Japan to get her adversary to consent to her peace terms. Also, that the peace terms had to be limited in extent so as not to harm the interests of the great powers. Thus, it must be concluded that it was assumed by Komura beforehand that sooner or later the good offices of a third country would be required to mediate, and that this was absolutely necessary for the termination of the Russo-Japanese War and the conclusion of a peace settlement. There's a couple of, well, 3 footnotes which you can check in detail if you pause this video. Okay, so moving on. At that time, of the great powers, excluding France and Great Britain, which were allied to Russia and Japan respectively, only Germany and the United States remained. And of these, moreover, Germany had become a sworn enemy of Japan during the triple intervention of 1895, see above, and was close to Russia. The only one which was friendly to Japan was the United States. Thus, it was probably natural that Japan would begin to develop her foreign policy depending on the United States and Great Britain. The dependence was simultaneously on funds to prosecute the war and on the willingness of one of them to call a temporary halt to hostilities at a moment of its choosing and play the role of mediator between the two warring nations. Both Japan and the United States had, since the end of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-5, restrained the Yellow Peril and sought to prevent joint intervention by the United States and Europe by forming a friendly climate of opinion towards Japan. In particular, with regard to America, Japan expected to be able to send the most suitable person to request the intervention of President Roosevelt at an appropriate time to mediate between the parties. And also with regard to Britain, it was Japan's plan to send another suitable person to maintain and continue to strengthen the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902, so as to prevent the war becoming a global one, while also supporting the negotiators in their applications for foreign loans and obtaining the most favorable terms for large sums. These things were earnestly desired and seriously considered by the leaders of the Japanese government. Marquis Ito's strong request. Thus, in January 1904, Meiji 37, Japan had virtually resolved on a policy of meeting all her war costs through foreign loans. 2 cruisers, later named the Kasuga and Nisshin, which Japan had purchased from Argentina through the good offices of Britain, left the port of Colombo on January the 26th, heading for Japan via Singapore. Then no sooner had February begun than the commandant of the fortress of Vladivostok, at the same time as proclaiming martial law, gave notice to the Japanese official responsible for trade that Japanese nationals would be forbidden to reside there and that they should make preparations to withdraw. In addition to this, the Russian fleet at Port Arthur leaving, and that's where it ends. So this is the end of the sample, which I'm rather relieved at because I think this video was getting quite long. What have we got here? It looks like the chronology which I made with the help of Professor Matsumura. Yeah, it's quite a detailed chronology on pages. Where does it start? Looks like it starts on, wow, it's quite a long one, isn't it? I'm just trying to scroll back to the beginning of the chronology. Let's see where it is. Oh, there we are. So yes, these are, it looks like the bibliography there, and then the chronology based mainly on the Russo-Japanese War. So yeah, starting in 1853 with the visit of Admiral Perry to Japan with the black ships and the birth of Kaneko Kentaro. He's admitted to Harvard in 1876, Harvard Law School, etc., etc. I don't think I have time to read all of that now. If you want to read it, perhaps you should obtain the book in one of the various formats. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through very rapidly. See where it finishes. 1942, May 16th, Kaneko dies, aged 89, from an infection of the kidneys and bladder complicated by pneumonia at his villa in Hayama, Onshi Shoso. He receives the Grand Order of the Chrysanthemum First Class. And then the index, okay, which again took me quite a while to put together. All right, so I think that's enough for introducing this book. Thank you for listening and watching, if you have done up to this point. See you again soon with another video. Goodbye.